Welcome to Storytime number 205. I'm Daniel Norcross in Dubai for the Women's T20 World Cup, and in Adelaide, smilingly beautiful, lifting my spirits at what is, for me, a silly time of the morning, is none other than Bharat Sundaresan. Bharat, hello. It's lovely to see you.
It is so lovely to see you, Daniel. The last time I saw you, we probably were watching the Yankees play at Yankee Stadium. That's how long it's been.
Oh, yeah.
And as strange a statement as that is, I never thought I would ever get to say that, but that is the last time I saw you. It's been a while.
Oh, that was one of the worst games of baseball ever recorded. Unless, of course, you really, really enjoyed pitching, which is fine. But if you're in the gods and you can't see what's happening to the ball, it's not much fun. Yeah, I remember it well. Now then, because it's story time number 205, it befalls me just to give you a famous 205. And I've been reminded by our producer, Tooves, that Alan Border's highest score is 205. But, and I like it, don't get me wrong, that's good. But it's quite a small, big score, isn't it, for such a colossal man in world cricket? So I'm going to give you a different 205, which is the 2nd of May, 1890. I think you might like this, Bharat.
Ooh.
On the 2nd of May, 1890, at the Antelope Ground in Southampton, the original English lady cricketers played against each other. The Reds played against the Blues in front of a crowd of 4,000 people.
Ooh, wow.
And my new big squeeze, the new woman I've fallen in love with, don't worry, Betty Snowball, you will always have my heart. But there is someone even older than you, Betty, and she goes by the name of Violet Westbrook. She scored 68 runs out of a total of 117. Violet Westbrook is a woman that almost nobody has ever heard of, but they're destined soon to discover her because a book has come out describing the original English lady cricketers, the first professional women cricketers, and in fact the last women lady professional cricketers until the 21st century in Britain. And Violet Westbrook, over the course of 2 seasons, scored 3,760 runs at an average of 51 and took 269 wickets. If that isn't sexy, I don't know what is.
Wow. Yeah, I know. I mean, sexy
Anyway,
ended in the 1800s. You're right. Yeah. Nobody's ever been
don't
sexy
you think?
since. Yeah, I think so.
Well, they've got these really weird. They have these really weird outfits, Bharat. You've got to take a look at these. I don't know if it's worth you. I don't know if you can see on here, but um, can you see that? I mean, that is one
Yeah,
crazy
wow.
outfit to play cricket in.
Ooh,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, we would have
Read
just
all
spent
about them.
we would have spent half our day just describing what they were wearing, Daniel, considering we are such admirers of fashion. You know, not so much modern day fashion, but yesteryear fashion anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of zigzag piping that really gets me going. And there's some natty little sashes in there as well. How practical it would have been for running between the wickets is anyone's guess. Anyway, if you are wondering what story time is, and this is the first time you've heard story time, then you're in for a treat. Because ordinarily, I mean, it's usually Colo and Jeff, but for reasons, neither Colin nor Jeff is with us. But we are together. We are reunited. We've done these a couple of times before. They can go on for quite a long time um, when we're involved, as you've seen, because already we're 6 minutes in and we haven't even told you what story time is. But story time is based on the marvelous nerd pledge principle, which is when lovely people like yourselves pledge an amount of money in whatever currency you so desire, and then we are asked to weave a story around that number. Sometimes that story will be one that we've got a free pass on, like I've got one today, and sometimes that story will come with an attendant clue. Uh, so the story will relate to something very specific. I've also got one of those today. I don't know what Bharat's stories are, and he doesn't really know what my stories are. We just soak ourselves in the warm bath of stories, and you get to listen to us enjoying it. Now, that doesn't mean you'll enjoy it, but it does mean that we'll enjoy it. And that, after all, is part of the point. So, I should also say that we thank our principal sponsor, Ambassador Cruise Line, who helps to make this all possible. I'll be telling you all about a fantastic opportunity that you can get to go on a cruise with cricketing legends, but that's for later in the show. For now, I want Bharat to kick off with his first number. Tell me what it is and what it's all about.
I certainly will, Daniel. And just to kind of add on to what you were saying about how these can go for a while when you and I do it, I heard the last time we did it, someone finished an entire marathon. So, uh, that's good. They finished the marathon. They didn't pass out halfway because they were listening to you and me. So that's a success in my book. And before I get to my first number, when you and I do this together, it also gives us an opportunity to sing. We got the final word in our hands. We got the final word in our hands. We need to I don't know. We need to release our own album. By the way, I'm back playing the drums, Daniel. So it's a big development that you don't know about. Yeah, it's been a while. And speaking on something which is not connected to my drum playing at all, let's go to the first number, which is Peter T. And Peter T's contribution was 6.51. It was in AUD, Australian dollars, plastic money, not paper. So generally the way this works is we go by the currency and think of someone from that particular country. But when I do story time, Daniel, and I think it's the same for you, we also want to learn something about someone we had not heard of before or we didn't know anything about. So I went into the roots, as you do, into the weeds and the roots and all that put together, underground basically, and found myself a South African cricketer. Yes, he was not from Australia, but someone you will enjoy listening to about Peter T, because I found Jeff Chubb. And Jeff Chubb. It has
I'm sorry, the name's got me excited already.
I know,
Jeff Chubb.
It
Yeah, he sounds to me like a kind of shot putter in the 1970s. Next up, Geoff Chubb, a policeman from Saffron Walden.
And as fascinating as that shot putter would have been, Jeff Chubb is probably the most extraordinary cricketer that I had never heard of before this afternoon, really. And that's how intriguing his life story is. But even before we get into his life story, 6.51, Jeff Chubb's best figures in Test cricket, 6 for 51, came in his third Test match. And he played only 5 Test matches, all in one series. And when he took 6 for 51, he became not at that point, but at this moment, he's the 14th oldest man to have taken a 5-wicket haul in Test cricket, which, you'd think 14th, it's not really up there, it's not down there, it doesn't really count, till you really get to know more about Jeff Chubb. Because Jeff Chubb, if you look, and it starts with the way he looks, and I'm not surprised that as soon as you heard his name, you thought of a big, chunky shot putter. But no, if you Google Jeff Chubb, he looks like David Steele, but he was also a fast bowler who made his debut at 40, despite not having started his career as a fast bowler. It's extraordinary. And by the time he made his Test debut, Daniel, Jeff Chubb had already also been a prisoner of war during World War II. And he'd been imprisoned by none other than Rommel himself. I mean, the Rommel.
Desert
Hitler
Rats.
Rommel. Yeah.
Hitler, that's big. Yeah,
that's big. Not any Rommel. The Hitler's, I don't know, he had a few right-hand men, maybe his left-hand man. Yeah, the general, the main guy who ran the war. So that's Rommel. And, so Jeff Chubb's originally from Johannesburg. He has another brother who also plays cricket. Fair-haired, studious, and bespectacled is how Jeff Chubb was described as throughout his life, which also then makes his Test debut or Test career even more extraordinary, considering it started at 40. So he starts playing first-class cricket in 1931 as an opener, and he plays alongside Dave Nurse. And later on, you find out why I mentioned that unnecessary fact. And he has a decent start. He makes runs in his first game, plays for a couple of years, and then takes a break for 5 years because very early on in his career, he gets into business and he has better things to do in his life. And then returns to first-class cricket 4 or 5 years later. And it's only towards the end of the 1930s, just before World War II breaks out, that he tries his hand at fast bowling, and immediately he finds some success. And he was described by Wisden as being a disarmingly effective fast bowler. How cool is that? Like, yeah, and
Disarmingly effective. I love that. So, yeah, I mean, how would that feel like? Disarmingly effective. Ooh, I say, how effective you are, with a little giggle.
yeah, exactly. And I found a caricature of Mr. Chubb as a picture of Mr. Chubb. He looks like the kindly bookkeeper. He looks like the professor
Mm,
who teaches you not even history. Even history is too much for him. Like fine art, like the history of fine art, like of
mm,
tap dancing, like one of those guys who is so
yeah.
niche that you wouldn't expect him to do anything but that. Um, but Jeff Chubb was a fast bowler who uh, had a long run up, took the new ball, and also could bowl long spells. Not when he was 25, Daniel, but when he was 40. So during World War II,
Ooh.
and this is before we come to his test career, he, like I said, ends up as a prisoner of war. And here, so he's there for 3 years in a frigid church in Italy somewhere before being moved to Germany. While he's in prison, he meets two other South Africans, including this young kid called Mike Rosholt. And because Chubb doesn't have much else to do, he somehow procures an accountancy book, and he kind of literally tutors Rosholt while they're both prisoners of war. And so when they're both released, Rosholt goes back to South Africa, gives his accountancy exam, stands first. So he's the first ranked CA student after the examination all throughout South Africa in 1946. And then Mike Rosholt ends up being one of the pioneers of business for South Africa. He's an anti-apartheid a crusader, despite being a white man in the peak of apartheid, like during the 70s and 80s. Becomes good friends with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as well. So I don't know how you look at that, Daniel.
Mm.
And then later on, also a
Difficult. They were
confidant
difficult
of.
times. They were difficult times, Bharat. Difficult times. I mean, you had to take your friends where you could get them, and
Yeah,
they were moderately influential. Although Margaret Thatcher, I'm not sure she was quite as anti-apartheid, perhaps, as our hero here.
you would think
But
so. You
I
would
mean,
think so. Yeah.
yeah, well, she was kind of anti-sanctions, wasn't she? But let's not go down that rabbit hole.
No, let's not. Like, let's just go back and listen to Roger Waters singing about her. That's one of my favorite renditions about Margaret Thatcher. But anyway, that's for another day. Roger Waters on Margaret Thatcher. Maggie, Maggie, what have you done? So going back to Chubb. So Mike Rossold then ends up completely changing the phase of business in South Africa. And it all goes back to his chance meeting with Chubb as a prisoner of war in Italy. So you could have stopped Jeff Chubb's life there and said, oh, he'd already, his contribution to society in South Africa and the world probably is complete. He produced this young kid and turned him into this, pioneering accountant, and business magnate. And Roswell died only a few years ago, so I haven't read his obituary for no reason really, but I did and learned more about him. But then, the while Roswell goes into business and economics, so Jeff comes back. I mean, Jeff will come back to this and do a better job of of story time. But Jeff Chubb comes back in 1947-48, has a great first class season, takes a break, and then comes back and has another extraordinary 1949-50 season, and does really well the next year as well, and gets picked for his first Test tour of England in 1951. And by this time, Dudley Nurse, his father, he started his first class career with 20 years ago, is one of the main batters in the side. That team includes Eric Rowan, and Jackie McGlew makes his debut in the same Test as
Mm.
our good friend Jeff Chubb. And for a 40-year-old debutant taking the new ball in the first Test, on Test debut, he bowls 46 overs. It doesn't go for too many runs, takes 4 wickets, and Wisden, like whoever was writing for Wisden at that point, is completely taken by this guy because of the way he looks, bespectacled, silver head, runs in long run up,
Mm.
and he just keeps plugging away. And he's doing the same in the tour games as well against the counties. Eventually ends up as the highest wicket taker of the tour for the
Ooh.
tour. And also that Test match happens to be the one where South Africa win in England for the first time. So Chubb makes his debut and plays a big role with 6 wickets overall in South Africa's first win on English soil. I mean, that's extraordinary when you think of it, right? Like everybody talks
Mm.
about McGlew and Nurse and Eric Rowan's 236 is every statistician's like wet dream, but nobody talks about Geoff Chubb despite his contribution in the first
So
test.
would it be fair to say that Jeff Chubb unlocked the mystery of how to play in England? That was a diabolical
That's
bit.
very good.
But I needed to make some contribution because all the time you've been saying Jeff Chubb, all I can think of is a great big chunky key at the bottom of my door with Chubb written on it. And also, I cheated a little bit and went to have a little look at him because you described him, and I
Yes.
thought he sounds kindly and disarmingly effective. So I went to have a little look at him, and he's lovely looking, isn't he? He's got
He
those
is.
glasses. He's a little bit like he's like a sort of slightly less, he's a slightly softer Bill Bowes in a way.
Yeah,
Slightly more like school teacherly Bill Bowes, and Bill
he
Bowes
is.
is quite school teacherly himself. But there's something kind of like I think I would rather have Jeff Chubb as my school teacher than Bill Bowes.
And he proved his teaching credentials as well, as I told you earlier, as a prisoner of war,
Mm,
not in school. So,
mm.
I think he had even though he never worked as a teacher, except, in that frigid church in Italy, maybe he had a career beyond cricket. But his cricket career didn't last for too long anyway. So that's the first test. South Africa win. They go to Lords, and you wouldn't be surprised that Chubb, on his first day at Lords, had his name on the board, as you do, because he takes his first 5 wicket haul at Lords. And at this point, he's already one of the oldest men to have taken his first 5 wicket haul in the history of Test cricket. But they lose that test. It's the Roy Tattersall test because he takes, I think, 12 wickets or so. So they lose the second test. And then comes the third test when he takes his 6 for 51. Though it's not good enough to get South Africa over the line, Alec Betzer also ends up with a lot of wickets. So England are 2-1 ahead. And then they go to Headingley for the fourth test, where Eric Rowan does make that 236 that uh, I'm sure you and I have either listened to stories about or we have spoken about it at some point. If we haven't, what are we doing with our lives? I mean, that's a question we should ask each other more often than not. But yeah, and Jeff Chubb finishes the tour. Daniel, like I said, he finishes with the most wickets on tour, most wickets for South Africa in this series, and then says, okay, fine, I'm done. No more Test cricket. And by the way,
Oh,
24-year long Test squad, 21-year-old long first class career. I'm done with that as well. I don't want to play cricket anymore. And that's it. He's done. And then he goes on to become the president of the South African Cricket Board. He's a national selector through the late 50s and 60s. So he would have brought in the likes of Graham Pollock and Peter Pollock into the side. He would have been one of the selectors who did that, and many others. And yeah, I mean, passed away in 1982. But what an extraordinary life and what an extraordinary career. One series, all 5 tests in England, plays a big role in South Africa winning their first ever test on English soil, which is also their first test win in over 15 to 17 years, obviously broken with World War II. Is a prisoner of war, guides this kid to become a business pioneer, takes 2 5 wicket hauls. He's on the Lord's board, All Odds Honours board, is the 14th oldest man to ever take a 5 wicket haul. And he's done. He's done with his playing career. I mean, what a great. I can't think of anyone who started and ended their career in better fashion in one series. It's quite something. So, Jeff Chubb, what a
yeah.
legend.
I love that. I love Jeff Chubb. I mean, you're absolutely right. I'd never heard of Jeff Chubb. I mean, it's a slightly fishy name as well, if you don't mind me saying so.
Yes.
Um, but I mean, yeah, as you say, like you rise to prominence and you do it all at the age of 40. Like they say, life begins at 40. And
Mhm.
obviously, Chubb's life didn't begin at 40. I mean, what's probably done it all is being a prisoner of war. And it, yeah, a lot of people have a bit of a downer on war, don't they? But
Hmm.
I think it was the making of Jeff Chubb.
Oh,
I think he should have been down on his knees thanking Rommel for all those
oh,
years he spent in a frigid church before being moved to Germany. Which, because he would have, in those moments there, he would have been masterminding I imagine, that 1951 series. And I'm also taken by the fact that, when you mentioned that, it passes me over sometimes the length of time it took for South Africa to win a test in England. And there's a book out at the moment that Jared Kimber, a very good friend of cricket and the show and us, has written with Abhishek Mukherjee about.
Right.
I mean, and then this won't be. I don't suppose it'll have that test match in it because I think it's about the very first test matches that each side played against England when they won. So there's a lot on the very first test match, which Australia win by 45 runs. And then there'll be the very first test match that South Africa won, which won't be, on English soil, etc., etc. But maybe he needs to do a follow-up, which is like the first time each country beat England in England as well, because in a sense that's like it gives you a chance to do a sequel, doesn't it? And then Jeff Chubb can feature, and then you can consult, and then Jeff Chubb's name can be brought to a wider audience. Jeff Chubb, ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Chubb.
And I had to see if there are any more Jeff Chubbs around, Daniel, in the modern era. And I found one. Yeah. And I found one on Instagram. And I'm pretty sure even if the original Jeff Chubb was around in the Instagram days, his handle would have been this, because the handle was Chubby Jeff. How cute is that?
Oh, is he chubby? Have you had a look into his Instagram account?
It was a private account, so I couldn't, unfortunately, and with no profile picture. So maybe it is the original Jeff Chubb, who goes by Chubby Jeff these days.
Or it could be somebody who's like, I don't know, in a tribute to Jeff Chubb.
Could be.
And I feel like, if I ever adopted a child from whatever part of the world, I might call them Jeff Chubb. For some reason, I'm really enjoying the name Jeff Chubb. Okay, well, let's leave Jeff Chubb.
Yeah, because I think we've created some sort of record. I don't think anybody's name's been taken more often and one answer as Jeff Chubb's has been. So yeah, there you go. That's what we do, Daniel. That's what we do.
It is what we do, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to. Well, I mean, I could just say the names of the people that I'm going to mention over and over again, but they don't have the same beautiful resonance. I do like a double monosyllabic name, and of course, Jeff is a good name anyway. It's a strong name. We know from our very own dear friend, Jeff Lemon. But Chubb. I mean, it's nice in the mouth. And if we kept saying Jeff Chubb for another hour and a half, I think we'd have produced the best episode of Storytime. If we did it in different accents, if we did it standing on our head, if we did it bouncing up and down on a trampoline. Actually, we should try that. But I don't have one to hand.
Oh, and if there is someone running a marathon listening to us again doing story time, it's in a non-offensive way and an unoffensive way. Someone just going chub, 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 chub over while you run a marathon might be motivational for some.
Oh, yeah, because I suppose it's going to give you a certain kind of rhythm, isn't it? There's that to consider as well. Mm-hmm. Now then, I'm going to move on because it's my turn now. And I say my turn. I was given a free hit. And the thing about the free hit, dear listener, is that I can do whatever the hell I like with it. Mm-hmm. And this one has come from Joe Scott Hartley. And the number is £7.75 in new Great British pounds sterling. No, I think it's a new pledge. In Great British pounds, Joe Scott Hartley's pledged £7.75, which is a very generous pledge, incidentally. It's a fair bit of money. And it's for me, and it's a free hit. And a few options have arisen, and for that I'd like to thank some of our squirreling experts that help us out in these matters. Nick Compton, the wonderful, slightly eccentric Nick Compton, photographer, of course, owner of lustrous hair, not as long as yours, but certainly thick, kind of hair you want to run your fingers through and then have a little rustle.
Yeah.
He made 775 test runs. Contrasting character, a man who is, if not Jeff Chubb, is Chubby Rob Key. And actually, strangely enough, since Keys and Chubbs and Chubby and Rob, Jeff. I mean, there's something's happening. It's in the stars. Rob Key and Joe. I think Rob Key might be the English Jeff Chubb.
Yeah, I think he's very
in a way. You know what I mean? And and I'm always very fond of Rob Key. He also made 775 test runs, which is a kind of weird thing, isn't it? You think Nick Compton and Rob Key,
I thought Rob
brothers
would have
by
made
another
more
mother?
runs than
Not
Nick Compton.
really. I mean, they all feel like they're part of a kind of southeast England public school mafia, but in very, very different ways. I don't see Rob Key necessarily as being quite an intense photographer. He's more of a devil-may-care golfer and lad about town. And a lovely man he is too, as is Nick Compton. They made 775 test runs, but I'm not going to go into them because, they've got their own contributions to make, and I'm sure their family would love to hear me weave a story about them, but I'm not doing that for you, Joe. Mushtaq Ahmed is a man or Ahmed, I should say. Mushtaq Ahmed took 775 wickets in English first-class cricket. He took more wickets than that overall, but in English first-class cricket alone, he took 775 wickets. 289 of them were for Somerset. 478 of them were for Sussex. And I'd completely forgotten, Bharat, that he took 8 of them for Surrey. I might have actually just done a story about the 8 wickets he took for Surrey. I might have taken each wicket individually, analysed each one, got interviews with the victims of each one, because the other 767 wickets are dead to me. I don't care about his wickets for Somerset. I don't care about his wickets for Sussex. They're not real wickets. The wickets he got for Surrey, I think, maybe actually Jared and Abhishek should do a book on the 8 wickets that Mushtaq Ahmed took for Surrey. But no. Instead, I went down a different path. Because 775 is a tricky number. I mean, there is a 7 for 75 that Fred Truman took against New Zealand, but once again, it feels a bit like, kicking a dog when it's down to analyse New Zealand cricket at a time when Fred Truman was playing. Because, frankly, they weren't very good. They were all accountants and school teachers and road sweepers. And it seems a bit unfair to remember them being like bombed by Fred Truman. So I didn't want to go down that path either. I wanted an uplifting tale. I wanted a tale that would take us, that would find us in an inflection point in world cricketing history. And so I searched for various innings in which people had scored enough runs to make 775, maybe the fall of a wicket. In England's 903 for 7, perhaps, or their 849, or their recent 823. Because it was pounds, so I sort of went down a British or English rabbit hole. But none did come to me. And then I thought, hang on a minute. Test match number 775. You know how you just have a feel for numbers, and you think, that'll be around the mid-70s. There was lots of weird shit happening in the mid-70s, yeah. I mean, we've got your Packers, we've got your Lillian Thompson, we've got India winning their first test match on English soil. We've got, things are changing, things are happening. The roiling ocean is bubbling up to create what we might call modern cricket. It feels like modern cricket is is created in the 70s.
Completely.
And so I thought, okay, what was test match number 775? Well, blow me down with a feather, Bharat, if it isn't a test match that you know very well and is unbelievably famous. But I am going to go back 2 test matches. In fact, I'm going to go back a little bit, even more than 2 test matches, to give you the context into which test match number 775 plops down like manna from storytime heaven to give us a moment that changes world cricket. And I do not use that phrase inadvisedly.
That's correct.
So,
unless it has to do with Surrey, that's fine.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah. So, test match number 775 takes place on India's tour to the West Indies in 1975-76. It's actually all in 1976, but we like to call it 75-76. And the background of this is that the West Indies had just recently returned from Australia, where they had had a chastening drubbing. Michael Holding had come into the side. A very young Viv Richards was sort of on the foothills of the Himalayas of what would be his stratospherically peaked career. Clive Lloyd was captain. And out in Australia, Michael Holding and others have described a pretty grim experience. Australia in the mid-1970s was perhaps the place that was not entirely friendly to Caribbean gentlemen, not in the way that it had been, strangely enough, in the early 1960s in that famous tour.
That's correct.
The Tide Test Tour and all that. There were sort of ugly rumblings of racism. And there was also an Australian team that was fearsome, that had done for England the previous Australian summer. Lilly and Thompson were at their peak, and they were bombing the West Indies. This West Indies team that we know would become perhaps the greatest team of all time, perhaps the equal greatest team of all time. Who knows? Who cares? Doesn't matter. But this team was not that team yet. This team had people like Jumadine in it and Imtiaz Ali in it. It had, quite frankly, players that were entirely unnecessary for the development of West Indian cricket for the next 19 years. Players that will be discarded, and with good cause. Because after taking a 5-1 thrashing, they returned dispirited and broken. There is a lot of upset in the camp. They're not getting on. Things are bad. And then India turn up. Now, as luck would have it for the West Indies, India, although they were at themselves, as you well know, in a very strong place with their 4 spinners, Bedi, Chandra, Venkat, and Prasanna. And they had a great kind of plan of their own. It was their plan. It was their 4-spinner plan. And it had a lot of success. They had, within not just living memory, but within folk memory, within player memory, within, most importantly, Sunil Gavaskar memory, defeated England famously in England. They were a proud nation, making their own fabled and legendary history. It was all unfolding before our eyes. But I suppose, I don't know how deliberate this was, but if I tell you it took the Indians 62 hours to get from their previous assignment in New Zealand to the West Indies to play their first test match, which I do always think is a little weird, isn't it? I mean, you've only got to go across the Pacific. You'd think you could probably row it in that time, but 62 hours it took to get there. They played a practice game almost immediately, got shellacked, then played a test match, got shellacked. So they're 1-0 down. Things ain't pretty, right? And suddenly the West Indies are on the up. But the West Indies at this point has not quite yet devised the strategy that we are going to come to know and love and fear and marvel at and wonder at, because we're still in this slightly different phase. I'm just going to get up for you the basic sort of like structure of this series. So the first test match is played, as I said, and India do not have a great time of it. They frankly, they're mullered by an innings and 97 runs. 488 for 9 the West Indies make. India 177 and 214. To give you an idea of their side, you'll know it well. These would be names that you were probably weaned on. You probably heard their names whispered into your ears as a young boy in Mumbai. The likes of Sunil Gavaskar, Anshuman Gaikwad, the mighty Gundappa Vishwanath, brother-in-law, of course, of Sunil Gavaskar, Surinder Ramanath, Mohinder Ramanath, more of them anon, because they will feature. The mighty Madan Lal, Kamani Prasanna, Bedi Chandrasekhar. They were no match for Andy Roberts, Michael Holding, Bernard Julian, David Holford. Suddenly, the West Indies are devising a strategy of quick bowlers. But for this game, and this game only, peculiarly, because it's in Bridgetown, Barbados, which favours the faster bowler. They get thrashed. Vivian Richards scores 142. Alvin Kalicharan makes 92. Clive Lloyd 102. These are names that we are going to, learn to revere. But next test match comes along, and actually, it's okay for India. They recover. There's a draw, which is always helpful in these situations, and a draw that they actually have by far the better of. It's a match in Port of Spain in Trinidad, which is renowned, isn't it, for being quite helpful for the slower bowlers. Another century for Viv Richards, but they're bowled out for 241, 5 wickets for Bishan Bedi. And India respond with 156 from Sunil Gavaskar, 115 from Brijesh Patel, a man I didn't really know properly until I researched this story time. He's apparently a very dashing bat. Were you familiar with Brijesh?
I mean, the most famous story about Brijesh Patel, who then later on became a cricket administrator, is how he was batting really well in a game in Bangalore, I think. And there's this lovely lady wearing a lovely sari who ran onto the pitch and landed a peck on his cheek, which,
Ooh.
if you think about late 1970s India, was not very common, Daniel Norcross. So Brijesh Patel
No.
became very famous as, the dashing, like you said, the debonair left-hander, I think he was, who received a peck on his cheek from this lovely lady fan while the match was on, who ran onto the ground. And subsequently, there were many TV advertisements made based on that, not involving Brijesh Patel, but it's one of those folklore stories in Indian cricket.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's very nice. That helps me understand more because I got some pictures of Brijesh Patel out, and he's a very dashing fellow, isn't he? He's a very charismatic man. Anyway, the West Indies, who are now miles behind on first innings, like in a pretty dreadful state. What were they? 169 behind, 161 behind. They they stutter to 215 for 8. It must have been really tight. I didn't find a report on that game very easily, but the West Indies must have been clinging on for the draw. They were helped by the fact that the first day was rained off. Otherwise, they would certainly have lost. And the West Indies side is much the same, actually. I mean, they've gone into a game on a spinner's paradise with, what have we got? We've still got Bernard Julian, we've still got David Holford, we've still got Andy Roberts. We don't have Michael Holding. I think he must have been injured. And Rafiq Jumadine plays. And Jumadine is an important part of the story. It really is a kind of sad side note to what's going to happen next. That match was Test match number 774. The third Test match of the series is Test match number 775. And this is when things get tasty. So the West Indies are 1-0 up, right? But they've had a bit of a shock. These Indians, and let's face it, I imagine there was probably kind of, we're going to beat the Indians in the West Indies, surely, even though we've had the chastening experience of Australia. These men, they're no match for us. We are great big burly fellows, and we're going to punish them, and we're going to see them off. Now, the next Test match should have been in Guyana, but I don't know why anybody ever schedules a Test match in Guyana, because we know what happens when you schedule a Test match in Guyana. Either somebody with links to South Africa turns up, so it has to be completely abandoned because the Guyanan government, understandably, goes, no thank you, or it pisses down with rain, or really, for 5 days.
True.
And so, brilliantly, the cricketing authorities in the West Indies didn't just go, oh, well, that's a shame. They went, well, why don't we just play it here in Trinidad? And given that Trinidad's so close to Guyana, I guess they're quite lucky that it didn't piss down with rain there as well. But I don't know, local meteorological conditions and such like mean that they can get the Test match on in Port of Spain. Back-to-back matches, a bit like recently in Multan. So back we go. And the West Indies have made a slight change. Having seen how the conditions were for the previous game, having seen how India's spinners had prevailed, Clive Lloyd, the captain, or at least the selectors, I'm not sure whether Clive Lloyd chose this team for reasons that will become clear. He gets lumped with Imtiaz Ali, leggy, I believe, Albert Padmore, and Rafiq Jumadine. This is not what one imagines for the West Indies team of 1976. A team that in 3 months' time will contain Michael Holding, Van Bernholder, Andy Roberts, Wayne Daniel, Bernard Julian, etc. But notwithstanding that they've got these numpties in their side, they make 359 in the first innings. Viv Richards does it again, 177. What a stellar start to his career he's having, tearing up trees everywhere. The Indians respond not very well, 228. Michael Holding's the guy taking the wickets. He takes 6 for. And in a hint of what is to come, Albert Padmore and Rafiq Jumadine pick up 1 wicket between them in 45 overs. Imtiaz Ali gets a couple, but, it's still not looking good. So the West Indies, they go back out to bat with a sizable first innings lead, and really it's just a matter of when they're going to pull the plug. They make 271 in 104 overs. Something that we forget about this great and stylish West Indian side is that, my God, they could bat slowly. But I suppose Trinidad doesn't help. Alvin Kalitcharan makes 100, and then the declaration happens. And then one of the most famous chases in the history of Test cricket unfolds. Again, a story, Bharat, I dare say you were weaned on. Tell me, the number 406 for 4. Did you have a duvet cover with that on it? Did you have a little pillowcase with 406 for 4 on it? Because this is what India score. It is the number that keeps appearing every time England, for example, are set 530 by Australia throughout the 80s and 90s. There's a graphic that goes highest run chases, 406 for 4. Tell me your recollections of it.
No, I mean, if you grew up in India in the 1980s, like I did, there's especially in a Hindu family, the epics are told and retold, starting with the Ramayana, where Bharat comes from. Then it's the 1983 World Cup final. It's all over this time. India run off the ground as Prudential Cup champions. We all know what Jim Laker said when Michael Holding got out. Oh, lost to school in the end. And then it's the Mahabharata, because it's also important to instill some religious values in your child. And then it's this game, Port of Spain. So even though for a lot of non-Indian cricket fans from that era or from subsequent eras, the 1970s West Indians are, like you said, it's always about Michael Holding, Andy Roberts, and then later on Colin Crofton, Malcolm Marshall, and Joel Garner. We all knew a lot about Imtiaz Ali, Albert Padmore, and Rafiq Jumadeen, because we'd grown up on stories about them. My father, I remember, used to listen to the commentary on his transistor, and he would tell me a lot about R. Jumadeen and I. Ali, because they would not always mention the full names, is what I've learned through my late father's recollections of cricket from back in the day. And he would love talking about it, how well Vishwanath batted, and how, because India had won the last series in the West Indies, don't forget, in 1971. So they were kind of defending champions. They'd been blown away in 1975. Not blown away, but Vivian Richards and Gordon Greenidge make their debut on Indian soil the previous year. So they were pretty even, the two teams. And yeah, it's a story that we all know all too well. And, for those of us who then later on got to know Mr. Sunil Gavaskar decently well, great storyteller. So he has some wonderful stories about that game, playing his role, his brother-in-law's role in the run chase, and also how comfortably they got over the line. I think that is always... it wasn't a dramatic run chase. It wasn't one of those, one wicket victories or 2 wicket victories. They just kind of said, oh, really? You're setting us that target with that bowling attack on this pitch? Thank you, Clive Lloyd. And they just happily sauntered home in the end.
Well, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? It was a record, and yet only 2 wickets were taken by bowlers. Jumadeen got 2 for 70. Albert Padmore, none for 98. Imtiaz Ali, none for 52. Poor old Michael Holding, none for 82, although I don't think it was a surface that was conducive to him. Clive Lloyd bowled a little bit. 406 for 4 centuries, as you say, for Sunil Gavaskar and his brother-in-law, Gundappa Vishwanath. Our man Bridgesh comes to the party again with an unbeaten 49. They saunter there, and it's another one of these West Indian declarations. And you can kind of understand why Clive Lloyd thought, well, we should be all right, for heaven's sake. We've given 406 for 4. I think 406 runs to get. I believe he says, I'm trying to find the exact quote, at the end of it, he's basically thoroughly cheesed off, right? And he goes back into the changing room. I'm trying to find the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, I've given you 400. How many more bloody runs do you need? And as a result, he's basically said, here we go, gentlemen, I gave you 400 runs to bowl at, and you failed to bowl out the opposition. How many runs must I give you in future to make sure you get the wickets? At that point, the writing is very much on the wall for Messrs. Jumadeen, Padmore, and Imtiaz Ali, because there is a codicil to Test Match 775, as I know you know, because it is Test Match number 776. And Test Match number 776 is very famous for a very different reason. And the reason why I say that Test Match 775 is the inflection point in cricket, is the moment that changes cricket forever, is that Clive Lloyd, clearly unhappy with the situation, goes to Kingston very soon after, and his side, well, it's a very different looking bowling attack. Rafiq Jumadeen does survive because he picked up 2 wickets. The others they can fuck right off. Wayne Daniel is in the side. Van Burn Holder is in the side. Michael Holding is in the side. The West Indies make 391. Then, I'm afraid in the first innings, India make 306 for 6 declared. Why have they declared, I hear you cry? Well, Brijesh Patel retired hurt. Not much fun. Is it Mahinda Amarnath breaks a finger while getting out?
Yeah.
I think Gundappa Vishwanath is also hurt in the process. And Bishan Bedi is looking at what's going on, and he goes, I ain't going to bat. And Chandra's definitely not going to bat because, bless him, he's like one of the worst number 11s in the history of all time. So you get this really weird scorecard of 306 for 6. West Indies make 391, and then possibly the most famous declaration the most famous closed innings in the history of cricket takes place, despite a very plucky 60 from Mahinda Amarnath. Dilip Venksakar's in this side, Sunil Gavaskar, there's some fine players, but Srinivas Venkataraman is batting at number 5, and he's batting at number 5 basically because everyone is injured or near dead. So with 5 wickets down, scored 97 for 5. When Venkat is out, Bedi says, that's it, pulls the plug. We're losing the series. Thank you very much. I'm not sending people out to get bombed. Michael Holding talks about it, talks rather regretfully about how he was asked to come around the wicket and bowl these bombs and cause all these problems and whatnot. And it left a kind of bitter taste, which I think informed relations between the two teams for a very long time thereafter. But it kick-started what was to become an entirely different way of playing cricket for the West Indies. And it started a period of dominance for the next 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Test match number 775.
Oh, well done, Daniel. And it's so important. I think it's one of the most important story time answers of all time. Because you know how it is, not just with cricket, just how history remembers things. Right? People always talk about, and even if you watch Fire in Babylon, it's a documentary, so they can't show everything, but they also kind of jump straight from this bad experience in Australia, Michael Holding in tears, and straight into it. Almost sounds like Clive Lord just came back on the flight, said 4 fast bowlers, like kill everyone.
Yeah.
They kind of did that in the first test, like he said, in Barbados. But like what used to be the case back then, Trinidad was always supposed to be the slow spinning track. So you would find spinners from either Trinidad or Guyana, like the ones you mentioned, being thrown into the deep end. And India always did well there. Gavaskar even they still sing songs about Gavaskar. And I think, there is obviously the famous Calypso from Lord Relator about Gavaskar, the Lil Master. And so they did go back, whether it was Clive Lloyd's idea or the selector's idea. And it was not Lilly and Thompson who kind of pushed West Indies over the line and pushed them to produce what would become like the greatest team of all time, like you said. But it was the little Indians, not the big, mighty, dirty, bad Aussies, if that's the way they're painted from back then, Lilly and Thompson. And I do wonder if what happened in Jamaica, this is India this is not the BCCI that you know of today, right? This is BCCI from 1976.
No.
So nobody cared. Like, India as a country was 29 years old post-colonialism. So it was still a pretty young nation. I do wonder what would have happened if this was England or this was Australia and they were the ones who were forced to declare players and all of that. Like, don't you would history have changed, or would them and we know what happened after that, right? The Brian Close thing, the Tony Greig thing, and how some English journalists and English cricketers looked at what the West Indies were doing. But imagine if it started with one of those two teams. You do wonder, would they have pulled the stops early and tried to do something to stop West Indies from doing that? Or we wonder how history would have been, because they found the little Indians who didn't have a lot of backing back home or in world cricket, and kind of bullied them into submission, which, like you said, has left a lot of scars over the years. Now, obviously, Indians and West Indies are great friends, but for a long time, it wasn't very good.
So we've done our first 2 numbers on Storytime 205, and just to give you a little glimpse behind the fourth wall, Bharat and I have just had a little break. Bharat has gone to make himself even more beautiful for his night's festivities out in Adelaide, and I have rushed downstairs to have a hasty buffet breakfast at the hotel here. with fewer and fewer women cricketers here because they keep on getting knocked out. The English are now gone, so there's no sign of Eccleston and Silverbrunt and whatnot. We're just left now with the South Africans, the Australians, the West Indians, and the New Zealanders, and a vast number of business people and children who really do get under your feet. I find it most annoying. People swear by children, but I just swear at them. Right. Crucially, this show would not be possible without our magnificent sponsors and without our magnificent listeners. And I have to tell you that we are brought to you by Ambassador Cruise Line, giving you the chance to cruise with cricket legends this December. Are you escaping for a winter holiday and thought that has always been a sensational idea? But are you perhaps put off by the thought of a travel slog to get there? Storm-ridden railways, contraflows on the motorway, and recalcitrant drones at airports putting a stop to your plans? Well, Ambassador Cruise Line has got you sorted. Not only will you visit the Netherlands, Belgium and France for a winter getaway, but on board an ambassadorship, the travel is a huge part of the fun. Swap A-road tailbacks for Alex Tudor, Gatwick security delays for Graham Gooch, junction closures for Jonathan Agnew, and hard-shoulder misery for Henry Blofeld, master storyteller. All this at the ridiculously generous starting price of £559 per person, and that's before you get 10% off because you listen to us. It's so easy. Just visit ambassadorcruiseline.com and pop in final word 10, that's final word 10, the number 10, at checkout, and you'll be sailing away, beating the winter blues. It's all in the show notes. Check it out. Ambassador Cruise Line, giving you the chance to cruise with cricket legends this December. I could think of nothing more fun, Bharat.
Oh, it's a pity that India are coming here and I have a test summer to look forward to, or I would have jumped on board that cruise. And I did the math, being the good South Indian boy that I am. So that's just $495 for a cruise. And I do hope that Graham Gooch is on mine, because I've always wanted to ask him one question. Daniel, 2011 World Cup, we were in Sri Lanka, we were in Colombo, and I walked into a mall and there was Graham Gooch, who was, I think at that point, batting consultant with the England team, walking ahead of me, just, having a good old time. And then I saw him buy underwear, and, I saw he was looking at the underwear section, and, I was curious. I wanted to know what kind of underwear Graham Gooch wears. I was disappointed that he bought the 3-in-1 pack. I thought he was paid better than that too. I thought he would have splurged on the more bespoke ones. But then I thought maybe he does buy the 3-in-1 as a tribute to his 3-3-3 against India when Kiran Murray dropped the catch off.
Yeah.
So I've always wanted to ask him more stories from Graham Gooch on underwear shopping. Wouldn't you love that? While you're cruising as well.
I would love that. Well, that would be the perfect thing, wouldn't it? I mean, also, are you a boxers guy? Do you like silk? Are you linen? Are you cotton? Are you rich Egyptian cotton? And briefly on the 3-3-3, before we move on, because we're very good at digressing, but I've got to record something else in about 40 minutes, and you've got to go off and have fun tonight. But I was reminded, a lot of people often say, a lot of people from Yorkshire of a certain type, often say, why didn't why didn't Geoffrey Boycott captain England more often? And I'm reminded of something that Geoffrey once said on the radio when he was thinking about the 333 of Gooch. And he said, and I'm not necessarily the numbers 100% accurate, but this was the sentiment. He said, he was dropped by little Kieran Morey. It was the easiest chance you've ever seen in your life. He went straight into the breadbasket and out again. He was on 36. And if I'd been the captain of India, I'd have got my hands round little Kieran Morey's throat and I'd have said, you've cost this team 297 runs. And I thought, maybe that's why you weren't captain of England very often. It's just a thought. I'm putting it out there.
Yeah, it's very...
Anyway.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, could very well have been that.
It's time for us to move on. We've got two more super smashing numbers. We've already had Jeff Chubb. We've had one of the most important inflection moments in the history of cricket. But there's 2 more lovely stories still to come. So, Bharat, why don't you tell us your second number and what you think the solution is?
For sure. And it comes to us from Gopal B. Gopal, my grandfather's name as well. So could be related to me in another life, Gopal B. Gopal B as well. So he clearly lives in the United States of America, like all good or many good South Indians, except my brother do. And his contribution is 3.13 USD. And it comes with a clue. So I'll read that out. So Gopal says, these are the bowling figures of a man in a match where he made his own significant contribution in an international cricket match. And what a contribution and what a match. His contribution was so good, it almost eclipsed the king himself. He was born 50 years too early, as I reckon he would be a world beater in today's 2020 format. Our sleuths up at Nerd Pledge headquarters went all out, and I think they focused a lot on the king bit, and most of them were Anglo-Saxons, so they assumed he was talking about the King of England, and I think a lot of them thought it had something to do with the death of the king, the one Lizzie's dad, basically, in 1952, and they assumed it was someone born in 1952, but not having ever, for now, lived in a country which was kind of governed by the king. It's going to happen very soon. My thoughts didn't go in that direction. I went more in the direction of, well, Gopal B sounds like a good South Indian boy, much like me. And you know me, Daniel, my love for the West Indies. And a lot of people from my part of the world had that special affection or love for the West Indies. So I assumed 3.13. So I did look at some bowling figures, which were 3 for 13 in tests and one days, but nothing really tallied. But you can also read 3 for 13 as someone having bowled 3 overs and conceded 13 runs. So 3-0, 13-0, also possibly as 3.13 have been bowling figures, 3.13 maybe. So I thought there's only one answer to that. So West Indian, 3 overs, none for 13. King, there's only one king. So Vivian Alexander, Isaac Vivian Alexander Richards. So I assumed he's talking about Collis King, or the guy that Viv Richards so wonderfully referred to as Kingdom. Isn't that the greatest nickname of all time? Imagine that. And Viv Richards is king and he calls someone else Kingdom. How cool is that? It's always stood out for me.
This is my kingdom. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of affectionate as well, isn't it?
It is,
but, yeah. It's quite a big responsibility, because you're the king, as in Viv, is going to have one hell of a kingdom. But I suppose that's also bigs you up, doesn't it? There's a lot going on there. Yeah, and I think you're on the right lines. This feels very positive.
It does, son, doesn't it? And so 3 for 13 or 13 runs in 3 overs is what he conceded with the ball. But what people remember of Collis King, probably just remember of Collis King as an international cricketer, is what he did with the bat on that particular day. And I'm going to assume you were watching this match live, Daniel Norcross. It was in 1979. It was the World Cup final, a few years before I came along. And Collis King obviously made the famous 86 of 66 that everybody speaks about. Probably the most impactful innings, bridesmaid innings in a World Cup final of all time. You could refer to it as that. I mean, there have been others. I mean, Damien Martin in 2003 with a broken hand. Gautam Gambhir, even though he will be the first one to call you and tell you, no, his was the most important innings. And it was. MS Dhoni obviously gets credited for the 6. So I wouldn't say Gautam Gambhir's was a bridesmaid innings. But Manas in more recent times, 2023, Travis said that partnership, they were in trouble when Manas walked out to bat. But nothing compares to what Collis King did at Lord's in 1979. Obviously walks out to bat. 3 wickets have fallen. England are on top, but Bob Willis is not there. So, goes to town, especially when he faces the mighty trio of Jeffrey Boycott, Wayne Larkins, and Graham Gooch.
Wasn't that amazing? I mean, it was amazing in those days, because that was how a lot of teams did it. In fact, the West Indies did it a little bit like that themselves, but Collis King helped to balance that side. That you'd have 4 bowlers, and then you'd go, come on, dibbly dobblers, between you can bowl 12 because it was a 60 overs, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I think the
it was.
World Cup then. And so you try and get, 4 each or a 6-4-2. And because most of the time in those days, people hadn't really worked out that 7 or 8 and over was even a number. Like it was, no, don't be so ridiculous. This is mad, crazy talk. You could sort of get away with going at 6 and over, and then your other bowlers basically played cricket. those fill-in bowlers didn't really play cricket at all. They just got through the overs while slightly bemused batters went, oh, that's a little bit easier than I thought, and take the single. Whereas Collis King, from memory, had a brain and worked out that they can go downtown.
Exactly. And I think I've obviously only seen highlights of that game. Wasn't Jeffrey Boycott bowling in a cap? I'm pretty sure he was bowling in a cap. And
yes, that's right.
Yeah,
he bowled in a cap, and he famously batted with Brearley for 2.5 hours without any urgency whatsoever.
I know. I mean, the only one-day run chase that Sunil Gavaskar can look at and say, like, hey, why do people always talk about my 36 unbeaten? Why don't they look at the 1979 World Cup final as well? Like, because Joel Garner always says, right, like, after we saw the way the England openers batted, feeling we don't have to do anything. And I remember interviewing Andy Roberts, and you just assume that mighty West Indian fast bowling attack, which we referred to earlier in this show as well, would just focus on blowing away opposition. And Andy Roberts was like, no, in one-day cricket, we just bowled to not give runs away, and they either got out or didn't get out, like Boycott and Brearley did that famous evening in that big run chase. But it all started with Collis King. And also back then, there were lunch breaks during 60-over matches, as there should be. That's a long innings. Imagine if we had to cover, these days 50-over cricket seems like a long time. Imagine if you had to do 60-over ODIs again, Daniel. If someone in the BCCI or somewhere, ICC thinks like you could get more sponsors and ads in, like that would be 120 overs in a day.
It would be a 10-hour. It'd be a 10-hour game at least. Because you're right, they had lunch and they had tea, because, of course, England famously went to tea in that final. Was it like 130 for none or 35 or 40 overs or something ridiculous, needing 290 or something to win? And so, they'd toddle into tea. And the great thing was they'd play for tea and they'd play for lunch. So, in a limited overs game, you don't play for the session interval because there isn't one. It's an over, it's a ball, it doesn't really matter. You just got to hit the ball sort of there. In those days, they would see tea coming up and they go, right, okay, well, we better dig in for 3 or 4 overs before tea. I mean, it wasn't one-day cricket as we know it. Really, it was like a one-day test match in those days. Red ball, of course, white clothing, and all that.
Yeah, maybe that should be brought back as a format in itself. Maybe just for novelty.
Gideon Haigh wants to. Gideon Haigh thinks that 50-over cricket should work to test match rules, so you have unlimited overs per bowler. Someone could bowl 25 overs, and you have no fielding restrictions. And he thinks the game would be more interesting. I can sort of see his point.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I'd love to see it as an experiment. Australia should do it, because, I mean, that funny cup they play in October and November, what's that all about? Just do it then.
Oh, the One-Day Cup, yeah.
See what happens.
And they have experimented with it before. They did the whole 4 innings thing concept many years ago. And but I think because of the way England are playing Test cricket these days, that's pretty much what they are doing. So it wouldn't be too different, you think, to what England do. Yeah. So, they stole your idea, Gideon. That Brendan McCullum did. There you go. That's what it should be called. I don't know, Gid Ball or whatever, because that's what it is.
Gid Ball.
Gid Ball, yeah. Well, Collis King was playing some baseball, but not before lunch. So West Indies go to lunch, like you said, they were consolidating their innings. They lost wickets. The King was at one end, the Kingdom was at the other end. And there's a very simple catch that's dropped off Ian Botham's bowling, and he's pretty pissed off as they go off. So they go to lunch, they come back, and that is when Collis King decides to tee off. And that's also when you have Boycott, Gooch, and Larkins doing most of the bowling. So without Bob Willis, England were a bowler short, and a premier bowler short anyway. And I was listening to some interviews from that were conducted with his teammates maybe 5 years ago. And some stood out. Gordon Greenidge described Collis King's innings, Daniel, as watching one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the middle with a bat in hand, which firstly I never thought of Gordon Greenidge watching cartoons, but that too, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like, can I imagine Gordon Greenidge just in front of the TV going, "Oh, Michelangelo's my favorite." Like, it just didn't, I never thought of it, but you never know. What do we know? And then I think Viv Richards himself in that interview speaks about how after lunch when Collis just went off, and there was a period where I think Collis King made 40 runs and Viv made 6 or 7 in that period. And Viv apparently said, I mean, you could get to a 3-figure score here, Kingdom, and just like, maybe take it easy. And Collis apparently kept swinging and got out. And then Viv said something which jumped out at me from the screen. He said, "Oh, people used to accuse me of not wanting anyone else to steal the show, but I've always played for the team," which I thought was an odd quote. Like, just like, it's very random. I didn't expect Viv to. I don't think anyone really accused Viv of that, or maybe someone did back in the day. I don't know. So that was strange. But yeah, and Andy Roberts and Joel Garner as well say probably one of the greatest one-day final knocks ever. And they, even though they were in trouble early on, they never worried about the state of the match, and they were just enjoying Collis King's innings. And anyway, he gets out for 86 in the same vein. Lives by the sword, dies by the sword. And as we know, that really in an international career, which is for 9 tests and a handful of ODIs, that was the innings that really stood out. And some of his shots, he was like the original MS Dhoni. I mean, there were some helicopter shots I remember seeing in the highlights clips where every time they went really full, he had the ability with his wrist to just like not move that front foot and just swat balls away. So those really stood out. But obviously the rest of his life didn't play out the way a lot of people thought after that innings. He went on the Rebel Tour. He came back. Fortunately, his life didn't go as awry as the case with a lot of others, whether it was Richard Austin, who I remember saying, Daniel, in 2011, when I went to West Indies for the first time, Richard Austin would just by this time he obviously had mental health issues. He would just keep running around the ground, like with a stick in his hand and just like saying stuff to you. And I remember he came up to me and said, "Oh, you're India." I mean, people would just say, "Oh, madman, stay away from me." But he was just poor guy. I mean, he was homeless at this point. He would just run around. And he came to me and he said, "You're from India." I said, "Yeah." "I bless you." And I was like, "Okay." "I bless all Indians, except Bishan Singh Bedi. He should die." And I was like, that was the strangest thing ever. And then he just ran off. It was so random. I still don't know what he had against Bishan Singh Bedi. But, Collis King. And then obviously there are even more terrible stories with David Murray and Herbert Chang and a lot of them. Lawrence Rowe. On that tour in 2011, they actually named one side of the ground at Sabina Park after Lawrence Rowe, and I remember interviewing Lawrence Rowe as well. Then 2 days later, goes back to the US and writes a column saying, "I never wanted to apologize. The apology was forced." And then they took it down. And I think that's when Courtney Walsh got his end. So a lot of strange things happened to people, although West Indian cricketers anyway who went on those rebel tours. There were others from the rest of the world who probably didn't face those kind of sanctions. And I think Collis King spent most of his life from that point on playing cricket in the north in England for Dunnington in the York and District Senior League. And I think randomly I might have visited this club, Daniel, because last year during the Ashes I was just staying like almost in another country whenever I had to cover a test match in some interesting places. So I remember going to a club where Johnny Bairstow started his cricket. And I think that might well be the club where Collis King played for nearly 40 years, made 50 centuries, was playing till the age of 63. And he did coach a young Johnny Bairstow a little bit, or coach or mentored him in his early days is what I've read. And the last we heard of Collis King was when Nick Holt interviewed him and his visa had been rejected or his passport had been taken away. And this is like a few years ago. He was stuck in Barbados. I think his partner is English. And that's the last I heard of Collis King, though I was supposed to interview him a couple of years ago and he never replied to my message. I don't remember what, but yeah. I guess if you had that one big spark, one big moment in that too in a World Cup final, even though I guess World Cup finals weren't a big deal in 1979, or we look at them retrospectively or hold them to higher regard. I don't know what it was like back then. I mean, you can educate me on that,
Yeah,
Daniel. But I think it makes sense if your career was like not very great overall. You need that one innings, and if it comes in a World Cup final, even better. Right? And in a way, it's good. It's
absolutely.
not, yeah, it's not that he had like an 80 in a Test match that people also kind of compare. No, they think Collis King, they think that innings.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, first came across Collis King in 1976 because that was my first year of watching cricket. And he was a little bit unlucky because, we were just talking earlier about the inflection point of
Hmm.
76 and the India series and whatnot. Because the West Indies went quite quickly to a four fast bowler strategy, they sort of flirted with Collis briefly before they thought, well, actually, if we're going to go with
Hmm.
four relentless fast bowlers and bowl 12 or 13 overs an hour, and we're bowling sides out for 200, 250, we didn't actually need an all-rounder. What we needed was literally six specialist batters, with keeper,
Hmm.
four bowlers. And so Collis kind of became more significant in one-day cricket because he did the thing that you were
Hmm.
talking about with Larkins, Boycott, and Gooch, because he could then because he was a proper bowler. He was
Oh.
swift. He was nippy. So you could then play in one-day cricket. You could play five batters, Collis King, keeper, and four bowlers, which made you formidable. As for what World Cups were like, I mean, 1979, it was a very strange thing. I was 10 years old. The World Cup, there'd only been one before.
Hmm.
Um, England hadn't made it to the final. They'd lost to Australia, wasn't it, in the semi-finals? Gary
Hmm.
Gilmore had done for
Hmm.
them. And they were very short affairs. I mean, the whole thing took
Hmm.
place, and they're all in England. So it was very easy to get around to. But the whole thing took place in about 3 weeks. Canada played, I think, got bowled out for
Hmm.
42 or 45 or something dreadful. And you had two groups of four, basically, I think, from memory. So you only played 3 games in the group. So there were only
Hmm.
six games per group, weren't there? That's how it
Yeah.
worked. 12 matches, one every day. It was kind of done and dusted in no time, really. So yeah, World Cup finals were a novelty as much as anything else.
Hmm.
But you know that if if your team won it, you had big bragging rights. I mean,
Yeah.
as we know, 4 years later, it became huge for India. And I guess there was also an inevitability because the West Indies had become all powerful by 1979. That strategy was working. They were a petrifyingly good team. Um, and so them winning was almost kind of expected. And yet, at the same time, the manner of their victory was so bizarre.
Hmm.
But Collis King felt really fondly towards him. It was quite an interesting contrast that you made there between him going on rebel tours and the West Indians going on rebel tours, and then
Yeah.
up against them were Gooch and Boycott, who of course went on their own rebel tour and were entirely, yeah, it was fine. Yeah, you just take
Yeah.
3 years off, have the money, come back. Captain England, that's fine. That's fine. No
Yeah.
one worries. But that's because Britain is a very, as we were discussing earlier, magnificently hypocritical country. And the chairman of selectors, Peter May, in 1985, 86 or so, was a man who didn't understand why there was a ban against South Africa. It doesn't make any sense to him anyway.
Oh.
So
Fair enough.
any chap who went out there to play, I was absolutely perfectly fine. Why wouldn't you? Anyway, that is Collis King. And I remember him with great fondness. And I'm very glad that you brought him up. And it also feels so appropriate given what we were talking about just before then. It's funny how these things happen on story time, don't you find? That,
Hmm.
the stories kind of weave and segue so well together. But what's going to happen now is that I'm not going to be able, I'm afraid, to weave quite the same splendid segue because the clue I've been given takes us nowhere near Jeff Chubb, Roy Chubby Brown, Locks, Fish. Nothing to do with West Indians either, I'm afraid. This is, well, I know the answer. And you will know why. You'll know why I know the answer.
Right.
It was also, I've got to say, our Nerd Pledge squirrelers were helpful in this too, but it's actually a number that for some reason screamed at me anyway because it's an unusual one. It's from James, and it's 266 GBP, Great British Pounds. It's updated to £2.66 for one of the less noticed retirements of the end of the season, but someone I have tremendous respect for. And see, mercifully, of course, what James has done there is he's given us such an easy clue because retirements, how many retirements are there? And it seems to me, British, English, I'm thinking of players who've retired at the end of the season. And when you go through those, and coupled with the 266, which is a number that screamed at me, and I thought that's someone scored 266. So then you go and look for someone who's got 266. You cross-reference it. It was, and I want to thank James for this because look, don't get me wrong. I like the tricky pledges. I get great enjoyment from solving them. I had famously believed I'd solved one once, which was 1187. And the answer was Ed Giddins, and I was so excited. And I'd found him on page 1187 of a copy of Wisdom. But it turned out that wasn't why. It was I got the answer right, but I didn't get the reason why. So you know, some of them caused me great pain and anxiety. All of them caused me pleasure in their own different ways. But getting a nice, easy one, especially when I'm in the middle of quite a heavy period of work, is something for which I'm very grateful, James. So thank you. And you're still waiting for the answer. And the answer is the great, I think it's a bit hard to call him great, but a man who has had such a strange kind of impact on world cricket in his own way, and has also sort of like been around at times when things looked like they were going to be great for him and then melted away. He's a man who was signed for £125,000 in the 100 for the first season of the 100. And when he was picked up for £125,000, the camera went to Joss Butler, and Butler's face was a picture of astonishment. Not, I'm sure, because he doesn't have great respect for this player, but because there are a limited number of slots at £125,000 in the 100. Are there like one or two per team? So to use it on this man felt like a bit of a flex. He's a man who then didn't get the £125,000 because COVID happened. And the following season, whilst playing in the tournament, he didn't. I don't think it was for the same sort of spondulics. He's a man who came into the South African team in 2015 for his first Test match, and then, poor fellow, the Test match had 4 days wiped out by a cyclone in Bangladesh. So he's like a kind of nearly man, He's almost like a kind of Forrest Gump character as well. He sort of appears in these moments of history. And it is, of course, 266, the highest first-class score of South African coal packer, Lancashire player Dane Vilas, and also, can I say, movie star, because he appeared in the film Hansie, the story of Hansie Cronje, Hansie Cronje story, and he appears rather hysterically as Alan Donald. Now, I mean, MS Dhoni would say there's no reason why wicket keepers can't be depicted as fast bowlers because he's bowled himself with actually some effectiveness. But I think it's because he looked a bit blonde and also because he could actually play cricket. Even if you don't replicate the speed of Alan Donald, you at least look like a cricketer. And they wanted some people who look like cricketers to do the crickety bits. So he did that. He then, after that debut in 2015, he was unlucky, really, to be around at the same time as A.B. de Villiers, and splendid cricketer that Dane Vilas was. He's retired now. I think we can say was.
Yeah.
It was his misfortune to be in the era of A.B. de Villiers, who was actually, coincidentally, only yesterday inducted into the ICC Hall of Fame, where I am here in Dubai, alongside Alistair Cook and Ritu David, something like that. So yeah, there's a whole kind of series of misfortunes around Dane Vilas. Not least of which is that he shares the same spelling as Dane van Niekerk, so I always know him in my head as Dane Vilas.
Dane Vilas.
Dane Vilas, yeah. A very different character from Dane van Niekerk, I can assure you. But a wonderfully explosive batter. I mean, a very exciting guy to watch. And that 266 was scored in Colwyn Bay against Glamorgan in the season that Lancashire were pushing for promotion, which I believe they got in 2019. And it would have been on the sort of performance of things like that he was offered that £125,000 contract. But other kind of nearly things about Dane Vilas is that he comes back into the South African side as wicketkeeper for a test match in Johannesburg, and he was at the time in Ayabecha, formerly known as Port Elizabeth. But I like saying Ayabecha because I practiced it lots and lots and lots for the Women's T20 World Cup. When I went to Ayabecha, I'll stop saying it. It's like Jeff Chubb all over again, isn't it?
It is.
But,
look, our marathoners need like something in the last push now, Daniel. They're nearing the end now, so yeah, you should keep saying it.
Ayabecha. I tried to explain to somebody how to say it once when they were going like, I don't know how to do it. And I said, okay, what do you call the face covering that often lots of Muslim ladies wear? And he said, what, a burqa? I said, yeah. If you were Scouse, how would you say it? Well, you go, bercha. That's right. Okay, so bercha, right? And now go, and I went, now go, bercha. And there you go. You got it. And before you knew it, I taught them how to say Ayabecha. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I digress because we always do.
That's what we do.
Here's our hero, Dane Vilas, is in Ayabecha when he suddenly gets the call to come and play in the Test series against England, and you think to yourself, in 2016, really, having been out of the side and A.B. de Villiers has come and quashed many of his ambitions and these kinds of things. Surely Quinton de Kock is in the side. Well, my friends, he was in the side, but it's the famous Test match where Quinton had to pull out at the very last minute because he had been taking his Jack Russells for a walk. And every time you go, I went in search of this for story time. It always says that these dogs were sisters, which I find a fantastic touch, as if it's important what their familial relationship is. And he was taking his Jack Russells, who are sisters, for a walk when he suffered a freak foot injury. So our hero, Dane Vilas, turns up and basically stands in. It's sort of the resurrection, but also the end of his career, I'm sad to say, as a Test match player, because I guess there are so many other people around, and also it's that slightly controversial thing about South African cricket. What opportunities was he going to have within the quota system as well? I don't want to litigate that quota system now. It is what it is, but as a result, he sort of thought that to be a professional and to make money, he would really need to go and become a coal pack. So let me see. I'm trying to get you his actual debuts and whatnot, because it's all a very brief international career, and it feels a little bit unfulfilled for a player of his incredible quality, because he only plays one T20 international, right? Which I find amazing when you think about what kind of a player he was. One T20 international against India in 2012. Shortly afterwards, losing his place to the captain, A.B. de Villiers. I like that as a kind of line. He lost his place to the captain. I think that's a slightly odd way of phrasing it. But A.B.
Who had a sister.
Who had a sister. Who had two sisters, both called Jack Russell. As I said, he made his Test debut in Mirpur in 2015. That was almost entirely washed out. And then he played those tests against England. In total, he only made 6 Test matches. For a player of his quality, it's extraordinary. He didn't pull up any trees, only got 94 runs at a high score of 26, average. So modest for the player he was. His first-class career is altogether more impressive. Over 10,000 first-class runs at an average of just under 40. Tantalisingly, Bharat, 39.97. Oh, how irritating is that? He did bowl a bit. In his entire career, he bowled 13 overs, took none for 56. So, maybe the work he'd done on the film Hansi stood him in good stead. But it's really as a one-day player that Is it fair to say this? I think it's as a one-day player and a T20 player that we most remember him because of his explosiveness. You know, his strike rate is over 100 in list A, 129 in T20s, a more than capable, more than handy player, really instrumental for Lancashire. And one of those kind of guys that, when you think about it, when you get an overseas pro in county cricket, the ones that sort of aren't going to play for their country but really could have done at another time, were it not for Quinton de Kock and AB de Villiers, means you kind of got them for the whole season, and they're bloody good, and they're better than the level that they're playing at. But then it's not that he wasn't quite good enough for Test cricket, but just that Test cricket wasn't really going to happen for him because of circumstance. Everything conspired against him, and yet he continued to play with joy and song and bring delight to literally thousands, or even tens of thousands. Yeah. Probably slightly more than that, thinking about it, because Lancashire's a well-supported club.
It is.
And what might have been if it hadn't been for COVID, he might have justified that £125,000 tag. 39 years old on retirement. That's another great thing, isn't it? Not quite your Michael Hogans, but another one of these great county players who have made a living out of it and enjoyed it and given an awful lot back to their counties. And they're often unsung because, 6 test matches and 1 T20 international. He's the kind of player that, unless you're a Lancashire fan, you're probably not going to recall in 10 or 15 years' time. Is that fair? But it also feels a bit unfair on Dane Vilas because he's better than that.
He certainly is. And interesting you should talk about recall, because I recall him rather fondly and I didn't know this till you mentioned it, that his debut test had 4 days washed off, you said. So that was in Chittagong. And then soon after, South Africa came to India in 2015. He plays the first test, which I did not cover, and the second test in Bangalore. Very similar to what's happening in Bangalore as we speak. The first day was washed off by rain, and New Zealand had reduced India to 6 for 34 when I last saw television. But on that occasion, I was covering that Bangalore test. So I have seen Dane Vilas play test cricket. And guess what happened in this test? So first test had 4 days washed off, and so did his third test, because that Bangalore test, I'll never forget. I was sent there to cover this test. South Africa bat on day 1. They bowled out for 200 odd. And nobody cared about anyone else because it was AB de Villiers' 100th test. And AB de Villiers was playing on his IPL home ground, the Chinnaswamy Stadium. So the whole stadium was going ABD, ABD, ABD. And poor AB de Villiers' parents had flown all the way from South Africa. And eventually, because it was so rainy, they had to be brought to the press box on day 1 so that they could be interviewed. And you know how Indian press boxes are. I've never seen an elderly couple so petrified because you had 100 people jumping on them because there's no cricket on. and yeah, in between all of that, Dane Vilas made 15 in the first innings. I had to check that. I mean, I don't remember Dane Vilas' 15. It wasn't that memorable, but he was caught in ball by Ravindra Jadeja. And I remember all the talk about him was because Vilas is a very common first name in Marathi. And everyone in Bombay especially was like, oh, maybe he's a Maharashtrian. Maybe it's a Marathi guy playing for South Africa. And then we all saw his picture and we were like, maybe not. But yeah, no wonder he played Alan Donald in the movie. But yeah, so 6 test matches, of which 2 had 4 days washed off. Like, imagine that. I can't think of too many other cricketers who had a career like that. And I mean, it was great covering.
This is what I mean about him.
Yeah.
This is what I mean about him. I think he's kind of unlucky. He's kind of like, all the time he gets close to his dream. Things totally beyond his control are snatched away. But then he does get an opportunity, which is, I suppose, karma, which is an opportunity he wasn't expecting, to come back into the side because of 2 sister Jack Russells.
Yes, sisters.
And of course, Jack Russell is a famous wicketkeeper, and he's come in to be a wicketkeeper, and all of the fates are conspiring together to help him at last. But it's not going to last, and that's the sadness of it. And then he lives out the rest of his career as a Kolpak, pretty much until Kolpakaru was removed. But a noble and worthy man, a very handsome man as well, I've got to say.
Very handsome.
Good hair.
I just checked,
I've
never met a Vilas who looks that
But that
good.
is... But that, my friend, that, James, is your man, Dane Vilas, or however we're going to pronounce it. £2.66 for that tremendous 266. And do you know he got that 266 batting at number 6? He's got 266 out of about 450 runs when he was at the crease. Very explosive innings, going it over, striking it over 100. That was his highest score, and it kind of like it stuck in the brain for some reason. I don't. Isn't it funny how some innings stick in the brain? It's like I think David Sales once got a 303, and that stuck in my brain. I suppose because I suspect James might be a Lancashire fan, I'm just going to let him wallow in the delight that Lancashire did win that match by an innings and 150 runs.
Oh.
And indeed, our man came in at the loss of... I better say this because I think we're contractually obliged on the final word story time to mention Glenn Maxwell whenever we can. He came into bat at the loss of Glenn Maxwell's wicket. Glenn made 31 off 36 balls. And
obviously, it was a much better innings than Dane Vilas' 266. We are obliged to say that as well.
Yeah. Well, Dane Vilas' 266, it did contain 35 fours and 6 sixes, so fair play to him, of 240 balls, until he was eventually undone by David Lloyd. He's captaining Lancashire at this point, by the way, which is another great distinction, as Lancashire racked up 545. And Glamorgan responded with a flimsy 138. Saki Mahmood, was playing as far back as that. And I don't know why I think of him as being so much more recent, but the injuries and whatnot. Richard Gleeson was playing, whom I'd first seen 4 years earlier go out to bat in a pair of black trainers against the Australians in Northampton, which was one of the most bizarre days of cricket I've ever seen, involving Stephen Crook. We've talked about it many times. But that was... And Michael Hogan was playing in that game for Glamorgan. So, hardy... overseas professionals that devoted their time to county cricket. You've got to love them. We love them on Story Time. I think James loves them. But we're going to wrap up for no other reason than I do actually, I'm afraid, have to go and record something for the BBC in 3 minutes in a cafe just across the road, and I'm already going to be late. But I do want to say, Bharat, it has been more than lovely to see you. I don't know when I will see you next. I mean, except via Story Time. When you're in the midst of the Australian summer about to begin, aren't you, I suppose?
I am. I was hoping that you would come here for the Women's Ashes, but I do have my fingers
Sadly
crossed.
not. Well, it's a co-production, I'm afraid, with ABC and the BBC will be doing that, so we'll send a very flimsy team. But I may, fingers crossed, I might get out there for it by other means. We shall see. If not,
I'm coming to England next year for sure. I think I'll definitely come to England next year. Yay! Oh, hey. Well, Test Championship.
Of course, India are playing, aren't they? Well, Test Championship final,
as well.
India will be here.
So...
it'll be brilliant.
It's happening.
But we'll see each other before then, because we'll do more story times, I'm absolutely sure. Thank you to all of our listeners. Thank you to everybody who sent in their numbers today, by the way, because without you, the program would not exist. And neither really would the Final Word podcast industrial complex, which keeps us gainfully employed here and there and hopefully keeps you happy as you run your marathons. We've had a nice sweep of cricketing history today. We've said Jeff Chubb over and over again, and Becher, and we have revelled in West Indian dominance, the start of it, the middle of it. We didn't quite get to the end of it, and we've also found time to tip our hat to a stalwart of English county cricket from South Africa. Thank you to Ambassador Cruise Line as well for being the sponsors of this programme, and to all of you. Bharat, all I have to say is a very fond farewell. Toodle pip.
See you soon, Daniel. Jeff Chubb.
I know, I can't wait. Jeff Chubb. Jeff Chubb. Hi, Becca.